very familiar with. As you know, it is being recorded. This series is a sort of big ideas, big books discussion series, and we're now into the fourth year. And we have had the most amazing discussions over the years, and I think today is going to be no different. We're talking about. I mean, it feels like this book is part two to the last discussion we had with Sharad Chari, which was also about Durban. And I feel like we're having a little bit of a mini Durban moment in the seminar program, a different, slightly different period, but overlapping periods, overlapping personalities, actually, in both books, overlapping histories. You've already heard about the Durban moment last week in the way that Sharad framed it. I think here we're getting very much more into the weeds of it. We're discussing Dan Magasiner's book, Available Light, Omar Badsha and the Struggle for Change in South Africa. And Omar, we're delighted to say, is also with us, although he may be struggling to hear. But this is a real thrill to have him present as well. Dan, I will introduce, is the professor of history, a professor of history at Yale, South African history mainly. He is the author of a former, an influential book before this already, The Law and the Prophets, Black Consciousness in South Africa, also of the Art of Life in South Africa. And this book, Available Light, really brings together a number of themes that you have persistently, I think, Dan, been working on. And it's wonderful to have you join us again. To discuss the book, we have first, we'll go first with Sean Jacobs, who's a professor of international affairs and the director of graduate programs at the New School in New York. Famously, we all know you, Sean, most immediately from the website project that you founded, Africa as a Country, which is part of our regular reading of the community that is gathered around here. Sean's also published a book on the media in post-apartheid South Africa and has written a number of really interesting essays on sport and politics. So contiguous sort of sets of themes to the book that Dan is going to talk about. And then following him, our discussant is Sarah Nuttall, who I'm so delighted personally also to have here. Sarah was my boss as director in my previous employment at WISER, the Wits Institute for Social and Economic Research, where she was director for 10 years and really put South African humanities and humanities of the global South on the global map. Sarah's own work, other than doing this amazing curatorial intellectual work, her own work is in cultural studies and literary studies. She's the author of Entanglement, Literary and Cultural Reflections on Post-Apartheid South Africa, and the co-editor of really a whole long list of books, most relevant to this, I guess, Negotiating the Past, The Making of Memory in South Africa. She's also just brought out a book on the artistic practice of penny siopis, a really exciting new project. So here again, could you think of two more perfect commentators for Dan's book? We're going to do it as we normally do, which is that Dan will open by telling us about the book, and then we'll move to Sean and Sarah. I did want to say that I think, your book really put a finger on a couple of themes that those of us who are from Durban and have worked in some or other way on Durban do. The first is as Sharad reminded us, apartheid's racism, not just apartheid, racism is such a spatially anchored project, right? Making race is so defined in the geographic sense. And Durban is that odd kind of geographic place that you quote Neville Dubois saying it was not exactly the cultural nerve of the country. Yeah, great line. But it was the political nerve of the country, actually, and it's the way in which the political and the cultural come together in your book that is so interesting for us. I mean, it's a book really drenched in trauma, I have to say. Reading it, you write so beautifully, but it was a heavy book. You write lightly about very heavy topics. It's an art to have done that, and well done on that. But it is nevertheless drenched in trauma, in the trauma of one person's life, in the trauma of the city, in the trauma of a country, and the various complicated ways in which we have navigated that, and perhaps using Omar as as your central figure in this book, plays also this other role, which is that it captures what I think is a very Durban and very South African thing, this sort of defiant and often aggressive hope, like attachment to hope, in a way that's defiant and can sometimes spill over into being an aggressive hope. Standing your house is the phrase you come back to often in this book. And so I'm going to invite you to tell us about the book and about what you see as its central contribution. Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Shireen, and thank you for having me. I'm going to delay for a second as I set up my slideshow, which I hope that you were able to see. If someone could give me a thumbs up where they can see the slideshow. Okay, great. So let me begin by thanking Shireen and thanking the staff at the Institute for African Studies and the Knowing Africa seminar. I will say that over the course of the last many years, it is one of the good things, I guess, that the pandemic yielded, which was the ability to actually be in conversation and hear from colleagues from the comfort or discomfort, depending on your own circumstances. And I really have enjoyed the seminars this fall, and to follow in the footsteps, as it were, the virtual footsteps of Kamisho and Sharad is quite thrilling. I'm grateful for the invitation. To thank you also to Sean and Sarah for agreeing to do this, and to Omar, who I hope is on. I know he was trying to get on, was having some sound problems, but to Omar and also to Omar's family, because I think that this project is not just about him, but it's also about his family. One of the downsides of doing things on Zoom is that at some point, one of my 3 pets might show up and interrupt us. And I apologize in advance if that happens. I hope it doesn't, but you never know. I thought it might be helpful kind of early on to give a summary. I'm assuming that most of the people here know who Omar is. And I apologize, I've gotten in the habit of overloading my PowerPoint slides. So this is a characteristically overloaded PowerPoint slide. But just to give you a brief summary of who Omar is, and that's the really important point, that this is a study of a still living person who is still engaged in many of the projects in which he's been engaged since really the 1950s and 1960s. And I hope that in the Q&A, we'll be able to have some conversations about the nature of doing this kind of work on still living people. As Shireen indicated, Omar is from Durban, and a lot of the project is from Durban. Omar's parents are born in Nuttall. He is, depending on how you count, the 2nd or 3rd generation of his family to have called Durban and the area around Durban home.
Sorry, Dan, can I interrupt you for a second? Do you want to switch the mode to slide mode? Because it's particularly busy with your speaker notes on it.
Oh, you can see the speaker notes.
Yeah.
That's embarrassing. Sure, let me figure that out, and then I'll have to go without notes, which is fine. Let me just figure out. That shouldn't have been the case, but it is the case, so I apologize. Okay. So, and now I've kind of lost the Zoom window, but hopefully you all can see. Is it? I'm sorry, this is the other downside of doing things on Zoom. Let me just share real quickly, and we'll do it over again. And I'll put it on slideshow. Um, okay, so you shouldn't be able to see my notes anymore. Okay, good. Sorry about that. Basically, just kind of to run through Omar's trajectory, which I think itself is a remarkable fact, which is that this is a person who has been involved in so many significant moments and movements in South African history, both politically and especially culturally, and the intersection of the two since the 1950s. Omar's father, who's pictured in some of the earlier pictures, first as an infant and then as a parent and as a painter, was one of these kind of Durban characters in the 1950s who was very involved in the politics of that moment as the Indian Congresses were beginning to coordinate with the African National Congress, as well as with the support of the Communist Party, and was beginning to build the sort of broad-based resistance to apartheid over the course of the late 40s and into the 50s. Ebrahim himself was never really an activist, although he was keenly interested in politics and cultivated a community of activists. And a lot of the story of Omar's life is about that dense community of intellectuals and creators who lived in the neighborhood and helped to kind of bring him up and develop his intellectual and political worlds. Ibrahim was an aspiring artist, but was someone who, because of apartheid, because of economic circumstances, was never really able to make it as an artist full stop, and made his living mostly as a sign writer, working in the shops of his wealthier neighbors. Omar he went to Muslim elementary schools in Durban, and eventually to the Orient Institute, the famed secondary education high school for Indians, people of Indian descent in central Durban. He's in that class picture, fourth from the left in the second row from the top there. And he began his high school in January 1960, which meant that he was in school when Sharpeville took place, and when, in the response to it, there was a series of protest marches that spilled out into violence across his neighborhood in March 1960. School was not really for him. What he got from school was the opportunity to connect with other students and to develop beginnings of a network associated especially with a small group known as the Durban Students Union, which was affiliated with unity movement organizations that had emerged in the wake of the banning of the ANC and the PAC in 1960. But he struggled in school. He would be diagnosed as dyslexic. He struggled especially with the authority that adhered in the Orient Institute, and he didn't matriculate, unlike many of his neighbors, and never earned eligibility to go to the Salisbury Island College, University College for South Africans of Indian descent. And when he left school, what he did instead was to try and make it as an artist, following in the footsteps of his father. And as I detail in the book, during the middle of the 1960s, there were opportunities for people of Indian or African or colored or white descent, there were usually opportunities for white people, to participate in the arts in the wake of the violence of the state of emergency. And in the mid-1960s, Omar begins to build up a modest reputation in Durban and somewhere else in the country as well as a graphic artist, especially associated with a biannual art exhibition known as Art South Africa Today that was jointly sponsored by the Durban Art Gallery and the South African Institute of Race Relations. And so in the middle of the 1960s, we find Omar, on the one hand, slowly building up his reputation as an artist and developing his own graphic practice. But at the same time, he's still very involved in politics, and he's involved in what we now kind of classify as the underground, really was a kind of a grandiose term for what were just scattered cells of people in central Durban attempting to keep the struggle alive, exchanging information, cultivating resources, and so forth. And that kind of dual relationship of being both an artist and someone involved in the struggle was to define his life. In the 1970s, he stopped for a while making art, and he emerges, and Shireen mentioned the so-called Durban moment a few minutes ago. Omar emerges in the early 1970s as a critical player in that so-called Durban moment. He develops a close relationship with Rick Turner and many of the radical students who come to organize these new nascent African majority trade unions in Durban. and also with the old members of SACDU and other labor organizations who had kept trade unionism alive even after the repression associated with the 1950s and early 1960s. Omar gradually emerges as a central figure in the trade union movement and becomes the general secretary of the Chemical Workers International Union, which is one of the constituent unions of this large, or not large is probably the wrong way to put it, this modest but growing trade union federation in Durban in the 1970s. The trade union space is a complicated political space. There's a lot of tension that adheres with it, as many people who've studied this period know, between those who would advocate for just simply shop floor issues and others who want to see the unions as part of a broader social resistance to apartheid. Omar gets caught up in many of these politics and gradually moves away from the trade unions. And it's here in the late 1970s that he begins for the first time to really take photography seriously. And on your screens, you should see some of his better known images. And it's in 1978 when he produces the first monograph of documentary photography by a Black South African called Letter to Farzana, which was funded and sponsored by Fatima Meer's Institute for Black Research, something about which Shireen knows a great deal. This book is almost immediately banned, and it's the latest chapter in what is an ongoing story of the relationship between photographic form and political practice in South Africa. And it this becomes Omar's primary preoccupation. And as we move into the 1980s, it's where Omar becomes, for the first time, a real national figure in South Africa as a photographer who's producing iconic images focusing in on especially what apartheid has meant for poor people's lives, working people's lives, and family life in the 1970s and 1980s. And then as a founder, among others, of what becomes the famed anti-apartheid photographic collective, Afropix. Over the course of the 1980s, Omar continues to produce images and organizes and becomes a central figure in the cultural struggle against apartheid. He, by the end of the 1980s, is directing a Center for Documentary Photography at the University of Cape Town. That's what he's doing during the period of the transition, during which Omar tries to help maintain that kind of radical edge of cultural production during that period of the democratic transition. And he is ultimately unsuccessful in that. The post-apartheid state does not continue this close investment in culture as being a critical theater for political commitment over the course of the period of the transition. That's kind of lost, and Omar is in many ways outmaneuvered by those advocating for a more normalized approach to culture and business and all other sorts of things in South Africa. And in the last chapter, and I think a really remarkable life of consistent engagement and reinvention, he then reemerges at the turn of this current century as the founder and the publisher of South African History Online, which is an organization that is committed to presenting as fully as possible the true scale of the cast of characters involved in the struggle against apartheid and taking those democratic moments and impulses associated with the 1980s, carrying them through to archival practices in the 2000s and the 2010s. SAHO, which Omar continues to guide today, is by all accounts the largest single repository of biographies of South Africans available online, as well as likely the largest online archive of South Africa-related history anywhere in the world. Those are just the kind of brief sketches of Omar as a person, and Omar, the things he's been involved in. And I don't want to take up too much more time because I'm really anxious to hear what Sean and Sarah have to say. But what I want to focus on in particular, what I think I tried to do in this book, which, as Sarah noted, is about trauma and about hope, is to consider something that, as someone who was trained as a social historian, that I was initially uncomfortable with when contemplating this project, which was the very status of biography as a genre, as a form of inquiry into the past. Obviously, South Africans have great affection for biography. Biography is perhaps the largest and best-selling genre of nonfiction writing in South Africa. And there are scores of biographies of famous people and lesser known people that constitute a very significant segment of books that are sold in South Africa. This is true around the world as well. But I was trained as a social historian. And so as a social historian, I always found biography a little bit icky. I found it to be something that I tried to avoid because of its emphasis on exemplary individuals who then were seen as they could teach us in some way, that they were instructive through their examples. So initially, when I thought about doing this project on Omar, I contemplated approaching it sort of as Omar would be, for appropriately enough, for a photographer, would be our lens. He would be a way through which we could see these moments in the South African history in which he'd been involved. He would be, in a sense, like our Virgil, who would guide us through these various levels of the South African underworld. But the more I came to the study and the more I spent time with Omar and the more that I really thought about this project, what I realized was that it had to be about Omar the individual, because people who know Omar, people who have encountered him, know that there is really no one else quite like him. And this is true. I think there's no one else like all of us. But in Omar's case, he is very much himself. And there are wonderful parts of that, and there are difficult parts of that. And doing the research, I encountered, I think, that whole continuum, that whole spectrum of different reactions to Omar and reactions and his own reactions to the world around him. And so as I worked on the project, I realized that I had to get over my own issues with biography. And I had to really consider this question of what constitutes an individual. Where did Omar come from? How do we make sense of him? And through making sense of him, how can we learn about what it meant to live during these periods and to be part of these structures that he was a part of over the course of his long career in South African history? Now, what that meant, and here, as Shireen indicated, that meant dealing with a great deal of trauma. In my sort of brief snapshot of his biography, I mentioned his father, who is an obvious influence to Omar, who's someone who, as an artist, as a creator, as someone who provided him with materials with which he could create when he left school, was obviously central to Omar's own practices and development. But I neglected Omar's mother. And I realized that in trying to understand Omar and his commitments and his relationship to the South African past, I really had to think about what it was like to be in his family. And one of the most challenging components of this project was dealing with the reality that Omar came from a broken home, that Omar came from a community or from a family, like many families in South Africa and elsewhere around the world, that was continually buttressed by suffering and by struggle. And in Omar's case, in the particular fate of his mother, Mother Miriam, who bore 7 children in the space of a decade, of whom 5 survived, and who struggled not only with the impact of her body, of carrying those children, but also struggled with mental illness. Omar and his siblings today have the language they didn't have when they were kids and define her as someone who suffered from schizophrenia and who was prone to fits of tremendous emotional outbursts, sometimes up to and including violence, and who led to a situation where from time to time the house was a really challenging place to be. And in the early 1960s, Ebrahim made what was doubtlessly a very difficult decision to have her leave the home, to kind of eject her from his family and to begin to raise the children on his own with the help of one of his sisters. But Miriam continued to be part of Omar's life. And what really opened this up for me was when I began to explore Omar's graphic practices when he emerges as an artist. What you see is, and this pencil drawing, which is second from the left here by Ebrahim in 1961, is abnormal. That Miriam typically wore a veil and covered her hair. And what you see in Omar's graphic practice was this repeated serial attention to mothers and children, again and again and again, but not intimate domestic scenes. There's no hint of sweetness there, but often just scenes of alienation, that when you can see him working graphically through his own experiences. But one of the other great values of this project for me was that Omar was a diarist during this period in the mid 1960s. And I was able to access those diaries. And what you see was his frustration, because he always felt like he was getting stuck, that he was doing the same things over and over. And I'm sure in the Q&A, we'll talk about some of the people with whom Omar comes in contact. But one of the most important, for purposes of the story I tell, is the young African artist, Damile Feni, who Omar meets in 1966, and who very quickly they develop a very close relationship. Damile comes to live in the Badsha home for long periods of time from 66 to 68, when he finally leaves South Africa. And Damile was also working through trauma. He was also working through how South Africa's realities, how personal, intimate realities were in dialogue with these broader social conundrums. And in his graphic work, which was very stark and brutal, you could often see him kind of processing that experience. And the relationship between Omar and Damile, I argue, opened things up for Omar, because Omar was always preoccupied with this question of what is an artist supposed to do? And his answer, as he arrived at in a diary entry in 1967, was the artist is supposed to make his individuality universal, as Omar put it. He's supposed to figure out a way to take his own personal circumstances and to make them speak to broader social realities. And over the course of his years kind of working and thinking with Damile's example, this is what Omar was able to do. By the end of the 1960s, he was still producing images of mothers, but they were no longer his mother in particular. They were instead broader critiques of South African society and the ways in which South Africa and apartheid and racism and poverty impacted family life. Now, to him, I argue this becomes a form of therapy, and it becomes a way of entering into politics as therapy, entering into and identifying with broader based social movements as a way of exercising and dealing with the own demons that he carries with him from his childhood. And we see this, I argue, continued in his photography. So a lot of his earliest photographic work, and then continuing through his kind of heyday as a photographer in the 1980s, you see this preoccupation with the question of family, how families are constituted by apartheid, how they resist apartheid, how they endure apartheid. This is his primary preoccupation. And my argument is that by thinking artistically and creatively about his own experiences and South African politics, Omar was able to attach his own self to the struggle. He was able to maintain this, what Shireen likes, and I love this phrase, and I'm going to steal it from now on, which is this notion of aggressive hope. He was able to maintain this evergreen, recreated commitment to South African politics. And ultimately, I think this is where I end up in this book, which is, in my prior work, I've really been interested in systems of meaning, how it is that people develop ways of understanding themselves, of subjectivating themselves in a Foucauldian sense, how they find ways of developing meaning that helps to make their individual lives about something bigger than themselves, how they generate communities in times of political peril. In my first project, I studied this in terms of Black consciousness, and my second through this art school that was run, and the question of what it meant to be an artist and how one could develop oneself as an artist, even through an apartheid art education system. And in this last project, what I see is how Omar developed his notion. I apologize if there's background noise. I'm in Brooklyn and there are always sirens. How he developed his own notion of himself through attaching his own traumas, his own experiences, and seeing them and kind of manipulating them into being emblematic of a broader national drama, and how the struggle became a means through which he could deal with his own personal experiences and traumas and find a way to articulate them. And it strikes me that this sort of meaning-making activity is really important for thinking about biography and thinking about South African history, because we see how it's in associating, Omar transcended the individual. he kind of created a community for himself by reflecting on what he himself had endured and attaching it to that of the collective struggle. It didn't come easily. It came at cost. It led to situations where perhaps his own identification with the struggle was so intense that it became hard for other people who were differently associated with it. It was personal and remains personal to him in a way that I think for some people is oftentimes quite difficult to understand and accept. And I document some of this in the book. But I think there's a very powerful South African history there in the ways in which people came to see their own personal struggles reflected in the national struggle and how they willed themselves into collectives. Because it was by willing themselves into collectives that they were able to make change, that they were able to build up that energy that could push politics forward in South Africa. And it's something that through a succession of collectives that Omar continues to do to this day. So leave it at that. And I'm excited to hear what Sean and Sarah have to say. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Dan. That was a great presentation of a very complex book. I'm going to move straight to Sean.
Thank you, Shireen, for inviting me. Congratulations to Dan for writing this book about Omar, one of South Africa's most significant documentary photographers, and also a public historian and an archivist. Omar's work, is recognized as Dan pointed out, for setting up the collectively run photographic agency Afropics, and his work with South African History Online after apartheid. But also, and in the book, there's a lot of work on this, is his artistic work, particularly the work for which he's publicly recognized, his photography, which is now captured in Letters to Farzana, Imijondolo, and South Africa, The Cordoned Heart. Just a personal note, I've loved and admired Omar, and I hope I can call him my friend. I first heard of him and considered his work while studying at the University of Cape Town at the end of the 1980s. I arrived at UCT 2 years after the publication of Cordoned Heart. It was housed in places that when I was reading a book, I remember these places vividly because I'd go around there to read newspapers, to hang out, to meet people, to participate in reading groups. The South African Development and Labor Research Unit, SALDRU, the Center, not the Center for Documentary Studies, which is interesting that I never found that place, but the Center for African Studies. I also saw that Omar Badsha ran the academic support program ASP for people who had UCT in the late 80s, early 90s. You'll remember this. This was a lot of my friends used to go there. So I'm amazed that our paths didn't cross at that time. But I was in my late teens, or what you would might call a young adult, so I wasn't probably paying much attention, or these people were like, they were big. They were not, I didn't feel maybe I could talk to them. So in the early 2000s, I became friends with Omar's daughter, Farzana, and I've also come to care for Leila and Nasima. And so does my wife, Jessica, and our children. So I know Omar, I know his family. And so I think the book, just reading it's very personal, I think, and it holds a special meaning for me. Even more, I understand something about what it took to break out of your assigned role in apartheid South Africa. Omar is of my parents' generation, and I saw how their lives were constrained. So I'm aware of how extraordinary it is that Omar was able to carve out the kind of life that he did, and that he's still standing. So I think in a way this book, and I don't know how Omar receives it, but I think it is in a way getting his flowers. He's getting his flowers while he's still with us, and I appreciate that Dan has done this work. So I enjoyed reading the book, and I've told this to Dan numerous times because I also read drafts of it. But rereading it in the last few days, the pace took me in, the incredible writing, the tightness of the storytelling, the attention to detail, and Dan's ability to capture so much history and people and nuance in just over 230 pages. And to Shireen's point about the kind of writing about trauma in such a light way, because Omar, in Dan's words, was a particular sort of participant. A lot of familiar characters of South Africa's collective story in the second half of the 20th century, particularly that of its majority, make cameos here. So people that and as a kid, as a teenager, you admire these people. You see them here: Harry Gwala, Albertina Sisulu, Nokokanya Lutuli, and John Gomas. I was like so happy to see Johnny Gomas in this book. Johnny Gomas is a minor character, but Dan brings him with the aid of Omar alive. Gomas was born in 1901, and he was one of the early members of the Communist Party of South Africa. Omar photographed Gomas in District 6 in Cape Town in 1978, and the image is reproduced in the book. Dan writes about Omar recalling visiting Gomas and finding him, quote, and this is just to get to some of Dan's writing, deliberated by a series of strokes, reading a newspaper by a light that streamed through his window in District 6. His halo of white hair backlit in a glow. He looked like a figure out of time. Within a few months, he was dead. Shortly thereafter, the government demolished his small house and that of his neighbors. I mean, if you read I could just read parts of the book if this was the point of this, but I suppose I have to say a little bit about some of the themes and the threads. So I'm going to leave stuff out. I'm not going to talk about everything. I'm just going to mention a couple because we're working against time. Dan's spoken already about the fact that he's done a lot of work on Black artists, creatives, and intellectuals under apartheid, and that this is the third book on these broad themes. At the beginning here, he said something about it, and I think maybe one of the things I'm hoping that Dan would say a little bit about more. He says that the point, because I was going to ask this, but he's answered a bit of it already, which is that it's about making meaning. And in his presentation here, he spoke more about sort of, kind of like why Omar's art, what comes through Omar's art, this point of Omar finding it's a form of therapy. But I think if you could say a little bit more about making meaning, particularly in the trade unions in the 1970s, and what he's saying about sort of how that plays out, and then in the 1980s, in Omar's role around the UDF, but particularly in Afropics. The second thing I think that's interesting about the book, and I hope Dan can say a little bit more about this, is that this is an urban history. Shireen touched on this already, that this is a history about Durban. Historians have mined the histories of urban Cape Town and Johannesburg, of cosmopolitan spaces in those cities under apartheid, District 6, Sophia Town. So this is a book about Durban. It's a book about urban KwaZulu-Natal. But I think this is my other part that I think that Dan does also well, but it's crucially from a world made by Muslim, Indian, South African families. I think that that's an important contribution. They are not they're centrally part of the South African story. And I was hoping that Dan could talk a little bit about how this culture shapes the story that he's telling. The other, three other things quickly. Dan introduces documentary photography through figures like Ernest Cole and Peter Magubani for establishing the traditions that Omar engages from the second half of the 1970s onwards. However, from the beginning of the book, there's another important figure in Omar's life, and it's his uncle, Musa Badsha. I don't know if I say Musa, I would have said Musa from Cape Town, but Musa Badsha, who worked as a freelance photographer in and around Durban. And Dan mentions, for example, that he had been around Ranjit Kali. I think he had gotten training from Ranjit Kali. Ranjit Kali worked for Drum. And I know that this is sort of a way that we talk about documentary photography in South Africa, but I'm curious as to this figure whose photos are in the first half of the book. A lot of the photos are the photos of Musa Badsha. I think some of these Riaso Naidu's work on the Indians, what is it called, in the 50s from Drum, I think sort of alludes to that kind of world that Musa Badsha is in and around, and I'm hoping that if Dan can fill out some of that. Omar's work in politics is very concerned with building solidarity among Black groups, particularly Indians and Africans. I mean, what Omar described as his formative moment, which is 1949, which is a series of violent confrontations between Indians and Africans in Durban. Later on in his own activism, his encounters with Inkatha, like there's one point where they attack him. So and also personally, I mean, this, as I said, there's so much nuance, so many parts in the book and stories that you could pick up on themes. Omar's own relationship with, for example, in his personal life. So Omar takes as an artist, Omar engages with people not because he's, I don't know, he got a grant and he's doing art with black artists. These are his friends. And then later on in the trade unions, when he starts taking photographs, he's taking photographs of his friends across these racial lines. He deliberately tries to exhibit in particular on a way. So Dan, if you could say a little bit more about that. And then just two other quick things that are related to this. Omar doesn't shy away from the racial politics of the left. And I mean, I'm not going to read the Dan's sort of summaries and Dan's takes on particularly like in I would say late 70s, around particularly Omar's work in the trade unions, but then he's getting involved in the ANC, sort of hanging out with Harry Gwala and others, and there's sort of tensions around the use of equipment. Later on, there are tensions around the relationship between trade unions who work on shop floor issues and trade unions who also want to be involved in the community. I think Omar is more of the second variety. And so some of these tensions are racial. In the 1980s, people would describe Omar as abrasive. But what this often was, I think Dan uses the phrase, he stood in his house. Maybe I'm mangling it now, but this is just sort of Omar taking on, if you want, would sort of without excuse, he's just sort of dealing with some of the prickliness of the racial politics of the left, which I think often in South African work people shy away from. I mean, I'm not going to read it, but on page 184, there's like a whole section on sort of ideas and things that people think about some of the actions that Omar is taking. And then just finally, this is not a question, it was just an observation. It occurred to me when I was reading this that there is a connection here between Dan's book and Mahmoud Mamdani's Neither Settler Nor Natives. And I don't know if you've read the book, but Mamdani argues that South Africans offers lessons for Palestinians and others in thinking about shaping new identities through shared struggles. And so he does this through a revisionist history of recent South African political history, starting in the early 1970s. And basically, he's sort of creating this idea that there was a creative turn in anti-apartheid resistance away from race, but what might look on the face of it like race again is sort of creatively working with race. So the 1970s marked the first time that the resistance did not reproduce apartheid's architects within its ranks. So it wasn't so people were moving away from Natal Indian Congress, Congress of Democrats, South African Colored People's Congress, and they were moving firstly towards Black consciousness, but then alongside it were these the student movements working with trade unionists in that moment of the big moment, the union moment of 1973. So they redefined blackness as a political identity, and that this then revitalized township protests and led to the 1976 uprising. And then later on, it reshapes itself again through the politics of non-racialism in the United Democratic Front. So the broad left politics of the 1980s, in that way, then shaping new political identities through shared struggles. And like what caught me was there's a way in which if Mamdani was kind of like, I don't know, people have quibbled around sort of the edges of Mamdani's revisionist history, but it was almost like Omar was actually living that. That was what I was like struck by. Like how even, well, not I don't want to say even, just Omar and his friends and the people around him, Rick Turner, Fozia Fisher, Nassima Badsha, even Zwellim Kiezer to some extent, Harry Gwala. I can go on. Like all these people, it seems, were basically, what Dan wrote was an account of one of those people who was trying to shape new South African political identities, which I know we can debate it now as to like, well, where did we end up? I don't think that's the point. I think the point is really in how to be creative about trying to imagine new futures. And I think this book really shows like how Omar was like actively engaged in a project like that. So I think I'm going to stop there. But again, Dan, an incredible book. Thank you very much for inviting me to talk about it.
Thanks so much, Sean. And those last comments, once more remind us that Durban is a particular kind of place of race making that is overlooked in these other stories about race. Thank you, Sarah. Over to you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Shireen and Gabriel, and thanks for the invitation. I've learned from the historians at Wiser that the highest compliment you can pay a historian is to ruthlessly disagree with them rather than compliment them on their work. I have some things to say, but mostly what I want to reflect on by way of opening is the experience of finishing this book about 10 days ago, and the depth with which the book has accompanied me around Joburg. I think a sign of a book that's really breaking new ground is its capacity to stay with you as other things crowd in. So Dan, I did want to say thank you for the kind of historical acuity, but for taking us into the life and work of Omar Badsha, but also sort of into this ever widening and very distinctive meditation on the question of art and politics, aesthetics and politics. And I also wanted to start at the outset by thanking Omar Badsha, who I hope is on the call. I can't see at the moment on my screen, for his work and for my own sort of increased capacity to carry his work with me. I wrote as a younger academic on his Durban photographs. And I think what this remarkable collaboration between Omar and Dan is enabling us to see sort of completely differently is, of course, the relationship between your early drawings, Omar, and the body of photography by which you're so well known. My South African colleagues Denai Mapotsa and Pumla Dineo-Gola have written recently on the useful politics of irritability. And I do think it's the slight irascibility of actually both of you that Dan talks about at the beginning of this project that deepens the project actually. And becomes a kind of gesture of deep affinity, if not necessarily affection, and drives this book with a formidable intensity. I mean, Dan, you comment on, and in some ways resist, but also try to be somewhat faithful to Omar Badsha's characterization of his struggle, to make his individuality universal. I mean, that's not a formulation we would necessarily use now, but it's certainly the relationship between a psychic life and the exteriorization of that life into politics. I'm quite interested in the sense that I had that struggle structures your own text in somewhat symptomatic ways. So you open up this internal and individual and familial worlds in completely striking ways via Omar's drawings, and particularly the figure of his mother. I have to say that Miriam has stayed with me throughout these days very closely as well. But then actually your text on my reading moves to the more documentary photographs, but also moves into history, sometimes even history with a capital H, more fully in the second half of your book. In other words, the psychic density of the drawings give way in part, at least, to the apparently documentary dimensions of the photographs. And it's into that shift that I want to ask you my questions, because of course, as you know, it's never going to be as neat as that. It's a wager that's full of shadows and charades. And that psychic life is not, I think, channeled into politics entirely. I want to contend there in the photographs in ways that you leave a little bit underread, I think, Dan, or at least warrant some kind of rereading. And of course, I'd be interested to know what Omar himself thinks about that. So in the first instance, I find your treatment quite brilliant of the way in which Omar brings his mother, the figure of his mother, into his drawings, and then particularly turns his mother into a kind of avian form, into a bird form. And this is, of course, Dumili Fene coming into his consciousness, the figuration of distortion as a means of starting to think the exterior, which is apartheid, drawing on the brokenness of his mother. But I mean, the originality of his gesture, which is not a Fene gesture in the same way, is the avian form, which we don't see anywhere else. Actually, I think in quite the same way in the history of drawing, well, in fact, not at all. And I really have come to a point where Black Mother, which you showed on your screen, which is the mother, the woman as avian, you know, as bird, as the sides of the bed fall away, becomes one of the most outstanding pieces of work that we have in its contemporaneity. So a kind of pulling forward on that. What's so fascinating is the very moment, and you mark this, and I want to ask you about it, the very moment that Omar seems to reach the absolute height of his original form with the avian women in particular. I mean, he drops drawing, he moves into activism to resurface later as a photographer. And as I've said to you, I want to ask you some stuff about that. I think that I want to know more from you about that, how that translation happens and plays out at the level of aesthetic form. And really what you try to do is say the psychic's gone into his political work. Or you try to say, you know, we get glimpses of the psychic life of the photographs when he takes empathetic pictures of children. He's really keeping his own ghosts at bay. But I symptomatically read your book as having many more drawings in it than photographs. And that's not true. But reading that symptomatically, I think that you could disaggregate the documentary, largely documentary photographs in a number of ways, Dan. Because I think you don't comment on the bifurcation between the portraits and the more obviously documentary scenes. Now look, the portraits, and I think some of this was in Sean's more autobiographical observations, are really the photographs that carry the psychic life forward, of the drawings forward. And so his photograph of Fanny in New York, his photograph of Azinar, his photograph of, just finding the place in my notes because I'm now talking freely, of the person that Sean mentioned, are so exemplary and so extraordinary that I think they carry with them the psychic intensity that he loses in some of the more sociological photographs. Can you comment on that? I also think there's another genre that emerges that I think you don't fully address, which is the portrait of two. There are a number of portraits of two, and in the case of the young girls in a park in Durban, a portrait of three, but they really are portraiture. And the key to why they are portraits on my reading is because that's where Omar is using the available light. And I think that you drop the light and the analysis and the close reading of light in favor of an argument that these become, and it's an argument that Omar himself is very strongly making, that these become means to an end. These become a force to build action and solidarity in the world, to build politics. So that would be one question about how to reread them more closely as form. Yeah, John Gomez, right, Sean, and Musa Badsha are sort of forms of portraiture that I think carry forward actually the psychic intensity that plays out as a certain kind of rage in Omar's politics. The second question has also to do with, well, where does the trauma go after the drawings? And I want to sort of point us in discussion, and Shireen, now stop me if I talk for too long, to the immense complexity in this book, but also beyond it, of the question of trauma and freedom. And I do think the question of trauma and freedom it is the question of South Africa in some ways. Where is the rupture? Where's the break? Where's the cut? Is there one? What about the continuity of psychic life, especially as it relates to freedom? And I think that this is perhaps where the insistence on the political and the pull of the psychic collapse against each other. there is no such thing as the break. This is what we struggle with in the South African narrative. We call it the born free generation, but Jacqueline Rose has talked briefly about there is no such thing as born free in a certain psychic sense. There's only the sense of what the past will have been for what it is becoming. So the ways in which perhaps memory and pastness, shift. Let me just take sort of, maximum 5 more minutes. There is on the one hand the avian dilemma, which I think you could pull through further. The bird that cannot fly, weighted by history and trauma, but which remains a bird. And I think that, I think that a further question is where Omar is unable perhaps to release his trauma into one version of freedom, which is, of course, in 1994, when his colleagues in Afropix, Paul Weinberg and others in Albie Sachs, are really saying to him, listen, it's time to make a different kind of art. And what he's, to roam a little more freely with your camera or your pencil or your ink drawing. And it's at that point that we meet his refusal. It's a complete refusal at that point. And what Omar says around then and in the aftermath is we need to be more accountable to the mass democratic movement. And it's this kind of insistent refrain at the time of political transition, which we could either read as trauma politics or the complexity of freedom, the problem of freedom in the context of trauma. The last couple of things I want to ask you to talk about is the paradoxes and dilemmas of non-racialism. And I think this is so deep for the Durban moment and for South Africans, but so obscure, particularly to American colleagues, excuse me. But I think that do you think that non-racialism at the end of writing this book and thinking with Omar's consistent commitment to non-racialism is less a form of freedom or future freedom that has suppressed trauma, And I wonder how that relates to his own insistence that his first memory is of incredible political dissonance between Africans and Indians. So his healing becomes an attempt to heal that by thinking of himself as a Black man. But I really wonder about the relationship between entanglement, which you bear witness to in his early Durban life, and enmeshment. And where Dan, what do you end up thinking about in the aftermath of writing this book in terms of the non-racial gesture as a means of trying to understand Omar's oeuvre? The very final thing I want to say is this, that there's a throwaway comment to some extent in your book towards the end, when Omar makes his first trip to New York, having been denied a passport for a long time. And you comment that he has spent nearly every night of his life within a few miles of the Indian Ocean. And in fact, so had his line of Badshas for nearly a century. It's not something you develop down in aesthetic terms, even though you do in sort of political terms, indenture and the politics of that and so on. And you don't really develop it in terms of the photographic archive you work with in this book. And I want to close by just pointing out that there is an archive of Badsha photographs that are generally less racially discrete than those that you discuss. And I wonder how they eddy in relation to the narrative you pursue in this book. He does turn his gaze onto a range of racial subjects in the city in a way that remains really rare in South African documentary photography, I think even now. But there's a photograph from 1979 called Whitey and Friends in Victoria Street, in which a white man living in poverty on that street holds his arms around 2 equally destitute Indian women with obvious affection between them. There's a 1984 photograph in the archive of Hare Krishna devotees of various racial backgrounds on Curry Street. And they're soccer players photographed at Curry's Fountain that same year, a lineup of men of Indian and African descent about to play a match. But clearly from their features, drawing from a range of descendants across that Indian Ocean world. So I think as we look at them, we really have to, reconsider the visual aporias in the archives of our photography and be more attentive to the fuller, perhaps, complexities of place and race. They don't fit into the narrative you tell in this book, Dan. They're nevertheless there. And they might just form the kernel of another book. There's so many kernels in this book that open up for scholarship. One of them is, of course, Fanny and Badsha, but the other is to discover that Fanny shared a room with Ernest Cole in New York. Something I didn't know, and a kind of what literary scholars would call a kind of artistic intertextuality of form that I think you lead us to and encourage us to write about. Those are my comments. You will know from them that I find this a really profound book and body of work. So thank you all.
Oh, thank you, Sarah. Profound set of questions as well that go well beyond, I think that speak to debates beyond just this book. So thank you very much for that. Dan, you get a chance to respond.
I don't think that anything I can pull together justice to the range of issues I'm asked to consider here.
Yeah.
Very grateful to both of the engagements. I just want to pick up on a couple of things, and I think maybe where I would begin relates to Sean's provocation about Mamdani, which I can connect to the nature of the racial dynamics within left organizations in the 1980s, which I can connect to Durban as a space, which I can connect to this really provocative question that Sarah asked about non-racialism and trauma. And then there's a lot of other things that I won't be able to connect. But I think that where I would begin on the question of Durban, which I think, and it does relate to some of the images that you just reflected on, Sarah, that I don't mention, and that are part of Omar's work. And there's others that we could add to it. And Ndolo, for example, the picture of that was published at a moment of great racial tension between Indians and Africans in Ananda, of a mixed race couple, an Indian and African couple and family in Ananda. Yeah. And there's a lot. I mean, there is this sort of like full range of South African people as Omar encountered them. And this is in one of the things that Patricia Hayes has written about Omar's work, that there is this great sense of encounter, this sense of his familiarity with this space. And even when he was no longer living in central Durban, he was still making it the center, one of the centers, along with Ananda, of his working life. And he's encountering people that don't fit the apartheid racial categories. So, or at least don't fit the apartheid spatial logics, I should say, which we know from South African history is always true, that there is this denial of the reality of the intermixing of people, even as the state is insistent on its legal spatial function. And I think that there's a couple things to be said to that relate to this question of non-racialism. Because as I've come to understand non-racialism as manifest in Omar's project, and I will apologize to be shocking on the Zoom world, but it's fucking hard. It is hard to maintain. It is not something that one can just say, I'm a non-racialist. It is something that takes consistent work. And I come back to there's multiple genealogies to the concept of non-racialism, but one of the strongest of them comes from the unity movement, which has been critiqued by some people. But this notion that especially Tabata develops in the 1950s, that the non-racial political community is one that is constituted in action. It's not one that's constituted in theory. It's constituted through events like boycotts that become generative spaces of shared political commitment that then transcend inherited identifications and ascriptions. And one of the things that we see here, I find really striking, and for my own work I found really fascinating, was Omar's relationship with Black consciousness, because he's very closely connected to many of Black consciousness emerges really as a Durban phenomenon at the end of the 60s and early 70s in the context of that Sharad was speaking about during the last seminar here. And Omar is both connected to these people, he works with them, but also kind of stands apart from them. And it's this, and he explains it as a lesson that he had learned in his political life from the man he refers to as Old Man Doc, who is a friend of his father's and is this kind of hub of organizing in central Durban, who was very insistent that there was every opportunity needed to be exploited, including something seemingly so mundane as hanging pictures at the Nuttall Society of Arts. That even in that context of being, it was a liberal institution, it was filled with racism and all these sorts of ways. But Old Man Doc's insistence was that we have to put ourselves in positions to develop community. We have to put ourselves in positions to develop those relationships. And so a lot of what I see Omar doing is that work of building these connections across community and putting himself in situations. The thing that I find very striking about his experiences is that it's never easy. It is something that takes consistent effort, and that you're always, within the context, you're always dealing with racism, even in putatively non-racial spaces. The trade union space, the Afropic space, contemporary South Africa, these are all putatively non-racial spaces. But as we know, they are spaces that are deeply, deeply racialized, and where he's encountering racism in very acute and sometimes more subtle, but nevertheless virulent forms. And so in his so it's that question of work that I think comes out of it, which relates to this issue that you raise about trauma and the kind of me letting go. And I take the point of the kind of the avian, and then moving into a more conventional, I think, for lack, I'd say conventional political narrative with some of the more spectacular sociological studies of the sort of heyday of the fists and flags motif in South African photography. And I think part of what's happening there, and this is perhaps also a product of being in dialogue with Omar in doing the book, is it's questions of narrative. And that so much of meaning is derived from narrative, this sense of who we are, where we've been, and where we're going. And the 1980s are a moment of deep trauma. There's a moment of tremendous violence. There's a lot of loss and setback, but there is also a moment of narrative momentum. And part of what we see Omar doing in the 1980s is this very confident narrative momentum that this is going somewhere, and that somewhere is that change is imminent. And I think what's so striking about post-apartheid South Africa, this is true of all over the world, this is not an original thought, is the lack of narrative momentum that apartheid, in a sense, gave one of the profits of apartheid, if we can put it that way, profits with an F, is that because it was such an obvious political, social, intellectual crime, there was a target to it. And one of the great challenges in post-apartheid is that lack of a goal, which makes it really, really hard to maintain that meaning-making narrative momentum. And I think that what's very striking, and I really like how you diagnose there the difference between the portrait photographs and the other ones. And I do think the portrait photographs, as I understand them, and this also relates to the question of work, not the work of non-racialism, but the sort of labor to maintain one's humanity that I see is very central in Omar's photographic practices. And I think that it reflects his own sense of the labor to maintain his own humanity and his own sort of psychic wholeness over the course of his young adulthood and into his adulthood. Because what you see there, and what I've always been very struck by in those images, and this is true with Afropics in general, Afropics as a collective maintains this idea that there is a proper way of displaying Black South African lives. And that what it has in common is we're not going to shy away from the costs of apartheid. We're not going to shy away from the very real economic costs, but we are not going to show people in any ways traumatized. People are displayed in their dignified wholeness. And those portraits, I think, really strikingly capture that. And when trying to make sense of those portraits, what I see is a couple of things. One, perhaps like Omar's own sense of his own traumas from the 60s, but also the critical, and Sean asked us to think about this as well, that critical moment of what he saw in the trade unions. And I go into detail, and I was very fortunate because Omar kept a diary in the 60s. He also kept a diary for a time when he was an organizer for the chemical workers in the 70s. And what he encountered in some of these factories is what we all knew and what he knew abstractly, but what he could see vividly in his interaction with workers, which was the very real fact of how dehumanizing that labor was. And in particular, he was working with a lot of people who were in paint factories as someone involved in chemical work. And oftentimes he documented the conditions under which these men, and they were male workers, labored, the conditions of literally just having no plastic gloves and having to immerse one's hands in vats of chemicals and seeing the skin peeling off of your arm afterwards. And so in a sense, he was suddenly face to face in a way that he hadn't been necessarily before with how dehumanizing even basic things like work were under apartheid. And he encountered people like Mafika Mbuli, one of these poets, who had reflected that in his own poetic practices. And when he develops his photographic practice, there's this emphasis on humanity. There's this emphasis on dignity that I think is really central. And it relates to another one of Sean's points, which is that, and one of Patricia's essays about Omar, she calls it seeing and being seen. But I would add it's also knowing and being known. That when Omar begins to photograph, he's not photographing abstract people. These are people that he knows. He collects life histories from those he doesn't know intimately. And in a letter to Farzana, a lot of the images that he captures are of people that he's worked with in the trade unions, that he has relationships with. And he's encountering them in these new environments where many of them have become banned in the aftermath of their trade union activism. And so that's why they're displayed only from the back, because you can't publish the images of their faces. But he's encountering these people that he knows deeply and intimately. And he knows that he knows the depths of their humanity. And so when he portrays them in portraits, he's trying to capture and reflect that knowledge. Now, that then is hitched to this narrative that the humanity of Black South Africans is what is denied under apartheid, and the work of organizations like those of which he's a part is determined to drive that humanity as critique against the inhumanity of apartheid is what is driving this struggle towards its end. It doesn't work out that way, but it is, that is the narrative importance there. There's so much else to get to, and I want to hear from other people in the crowd. Just a couple of the other, I think, Sean, just to go back to some of the things that you said, and we could talk we could have a whole session on Mamdani and what Mamdani can learn from Omar. But I think that also, there's a lot, about, and I don't want to pass up the opportunity to note the importance of Omar's uncle Musa, as you mentioned. And this gets to one of my things that I mentioned in the introduction, which is the importance of family and the sort of spectacular oddness of Omar's particular family, where you have these uncles and this father who's an artist and this uncle who's a photographer. And so many of the images we have in particular of Dumile in South Africa are from Musa. And it's actually kind of remarkable because there is these websites that are devoted to documenting Dumile's emergence onto the South African art scene in 1966 and 1967. And all of the images are images that Omar and Dumile, of that Omar's uncle, that Musa took. And one of the things I find most valuable in the book, my single favorite image of the book, is an image of Omar and Dumile when they're pictured in the Durban Art Gallery, in this space where Durban's, as I call it, like the modest collection of old masters is displayed. And they're sitting on a bench, and Dumile's lying on the bench, and Omar is sitting next to him, which is a picture that his uncle took. It wasn't an image that Omar curated. It wasn't an image that Omar used towards political ends, but it captured something about the intimacy that was possible in these spaces, which relates to the kind of the last point I'll make here, which is about Durban, and how central Durban is. And it's a space that is, as Sean put it, it's in a sense, I'm going to say curated again by these these Muslim Indian families that run businesses in central Durban, but it isn't exclusive to them. And one of the things that makes Durban so fascinating is this question of proximity, that you have so many people who are coming through central Durban every day, and so many institutions that are developed in central Durban in really just around the corner from each other. And so it becomes this space of just incredible generative energy that makes it very unique. And it actually, as I was reflecting on this project, I'm a city person. I really value urbanism. And it's one of the great tragedies, I think, of contemporary South Africa and anywhere really, the United States being very exemplary in this, which is what's happened to urbanism. And one of the things that I really found in this project is how that deep knowledge of neighborhood, that deep knowledge of neighbors, of who they are, of their families, of their histories, that way in which these seemingly random encounters can generate energies and community is something that the apartheid government certainly knew that was a thing and did what it could to disable it. And Durban remains one of these spaces that I think is such a powerful urban space. And Sarah, you mentioned, that's the last thing I'll say. You mentioned this image of the soccer pitch and these men lining up before a match. And there are these spaces that recur in this study and in Omar's life, spaces like the Curry's Fountain Sports Ground, which I had first encountered as the site of the Viva Frelimo rallies in 1974, organized by SASO and BPC in my earlier work. But here I encountered doing so many other things, including cricket matches and soccer games and and trade union meetings, and so many people gathered together in this space that itself constituted that kind of effort, that work of building new political communities that superseded inherited distinction and ascription, that I find really powerful and meaningful, and a reminder of what is lost when segregationist regimes are determined to crush urbanism in these ways. I know I haven't done justice. I haven't talked about Goldblatt. I haven't talked about so many other things, but I think I'll leave those responses to that.
Sarah, you raised a range of questions that take us who are working on political history outside of comfort zones, and your questions about how we might read the art itself slightly separately from these political institutional histories are questions I don't want to lose, and I hope we can maybe come back to it. We have a little bit of time for questions, but now to speak against the point I just made, I feel a little bit tempted to get into this discussion about the Muslim families in Durban, because it's not just that. That's, some of it is, but no, at the heart of it, of the Indian story, are also other families, the Naidus, Phyllis and her family that come into this book, Jivan Desai, range of people who are not Muslim. So I don't want people who
I agree with you. Sorry.
That. Yeah.
I don't want to take up time, but I agree with you. I was just trying to shorthand it, like Ella Gandhi, Mewa, yeah.
Mewa, Ela, the Gandhis, not Muslim. Okay. Please raise your hand. We have about 10 minutes for those who want to stay for comments and questions. I have a question as people are thinking, Dan, which kind of ties to Sarah's, is, the shift from the drawing to the photography. Did the drawing continue privately? Is there still a drawing practice, and what does it look like? Do you know anything about that?
One of the great sort of joys and challenges of this project was that Omar, one of the things that made it possible was that he tends not to throw things out, which I think is something that his children have to tackle now as they think about the boxes. And there are drawings. There's little drawings. There was one I have I found, which is a kind of a recent drawing. And then I think also he has shared some on Facebook of some drawings that he's done. So it is, I can't say whether or not it continues or not, because I don't see them. But there are like these little drawings and also not just that, but not just Omar's, but one of the great discoveries in going through the boxes was a little pen drawing by Demile, actually, if I remember correctly, of a bird that was just kind of buried in one of these boxes. And so there is that sort of record.
And we of course know him very well in the public sphere as the archivist of political history, but he was also Dumile Feni's archivist, and he continues to play that role and to drop these stories onto Facebook, which I hope somebody is keeping track of, because they're like the notes to the art. They're this drawing was made in this context, and that, yeah. But
there really are, and just to kind of speak to that, there's this. He has a really remarkable collection of Dumile's works, and including this one that I think that I'm pretty sure I was able to publish for the first time, which is this really sobering image that Dumile had apparently titled "An Artist Contemplating Suicide," and it part of what is this Omar's own archival practices is what allows us to read that drawing, because he has these letters from Dumile that describe his mental state, that describe his experiences, and they're really just incredible documents to see these letters from Dumile, where he's in Johannesburg and he's writing to Durban, and he's asking to be remembered to all of Omar's friends in Durban. And he has this great sense of humor about him in this very idiosyncratic way of composing words on type. And it is, one of the sort of joys of the project is that archival practice, which I know, as you said, that Omar himself is an archivist. And he got his start apparently very young in saving these things and these ephemera from his own life.
I'm trying to share these drawings that Sarah, the sculpture and the drawings that Sarah wanted.
Actually, I'd love to talk about those just at this moment, Shireen. That was an intuitive.
It's just giving me a hard time in sharing, so I'm going to just go here. Okay, that one is the drawing. Can you see it? It's a bit of a mess.
Yeah.
Sorry.
See if you can get.
Can you see these two?
I just was starting to develop a thought, Dan. Out of the extraordinary reading you do of sort of reading Omar through Dumile, and back again, and there's a, outside the Constitutional Court in Joburg stands a Dumile Feni sculpture, and I don't know if you know it. It's just called History, and it's a sort of a man, animal, thing, woman, sort of ungulate form of muscular labor. It's an interesting piece by Paul Clark about this. So right at the door of the Constitutional Court, the apparent home of a certain form of legalized justice, is this question of labor. And what I'm starting to see out of your work is, if we read a visual intertextuality between Feni and Badsha that is not literal but symptomatic, there's this thing between them that's trying to mediate labor histories. So in Omar's case, the intensities, shifting into activist work with factory laborers in more than 50 factories at one point, I think, in the Inanda area. So there's this question of labor histories, psychic brokenness, and artistic form that I think is forming across both of their work. And I just wanted to show colleagues on the call an example of a Fernie drawing, since they may not know it. And this one is from 1969, and it's called "In Putting the Broken Pieces Together, Some of Us Might Find Peace." So you have you have them both wrestling with form through brokenness. And if Shireen can find the other one, the question of labor, that's the one thing I wanted to begin to start to articulate. And the other one was just to say that, maybe it was never a sense, maybe it was never, there it is.
You can see it?
Can you see it?
Can you
It's
see
an
both?
yeah, sort of animal-human form of depleted muscular labor in some respect. Dan, the other thing is, maybe what we need to do is not the Albie Sachs thing of, be saying to artists, you should now portray different kinds of things. But that as critics and scholars, we go back and reread what was taken as documentary photography, but contains so much psychic life. And that's why I wanted to encourage you to go with the light in those, in those photographs, to try and re-access something about their own psychic intensity, which we couldn't see at the time because we were reading for the document. So this question of rereading is quite fascinating, Shireen. You know that I've recently been involved in a project here of sort of rereading Southern African literatures for water. And stuff we just simply didn't see because we were looking for land. I think all of these projects are emerging from, very generatively from what Dan has started to open up here. Thanks.
Yeah, well, I'm going to stop now and say thank you. Thank you to everybody who was quietly participating in the background. Thank you, Dan, for really a great book. And I think it's certainly going to be well received and I hope well read. Thank you to Omar, who must have found it rather strange to be talked of in this way in your presence, Omar. But we do appreciate and love you. Like Sean, I owe a lot to Omar and his encouragements on the side and his really commitment to all of this work. Thank you, Sean and Sarah, for giving us your time and your thoughts as well. And the next seminar in 2 weeks is going to be Peter Gesher and Rogers O'Rourke on their book on conspiracies in West Africa. So do join us then.
Thank you.
Thank you all.